It's Wednesday, people, and that means it's a countdown to Classic Day. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated World of Warcraft Classic. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and as you all know by now, this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert opinion on the hot button issues and content of the sure-to-be-amazing World of Warcraft Classic. Today I'm going to be sitting down with Warlock aficionado, DaReal MarkyMark, as we do a general blanket Q&A session covering Warlocks in vanilla World of Warcraft, as Countdown to Classic continues to have interviews that focus on all the available classes and specs in the game. After this interview, I'll play one call with listener Eron, who covers off on being an altoholic in World of Warcraft, as well as lightly touching on playing World of Warcraft with Asperger's syndrome and his studies into some of the personality archetypes that are attracted to certain classes in the game. After that, I'll clear out a few of the memory lane submissions that I've been sitting on and withholding from all of you whilst you've been patiently waiting to hear some fun stories from back in the day. So stick around for those. If you're a fan of the show and you consider yourself a bit of an expert in the field regarding certain classes or specs or any other facet of the game, then please do reach out to me via the show's Discord, Twitter account at Count2Classic with the number 2, or email me at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com. You'll find all those links in the show notes for each episode. The one thing I definitely would love to see more of moving forward is people putting their hands up for short calls for calling Countdown. They're a bit more casual and chatty, and I'd love to hear from more members of the community on anything World of Warcraft related that you want to get off your chest. But for now, let's get into this interview with DaReal MarkyMark about everybody's favorite demon-hugging casters, Warlocks. Hello and a huge Countdown to Classic welcome to MarkyMark, return guest. How are you, mate?
Well, how are you tonight?
I'm great. Well, I'm in a great mood, and I think you probably know why I'm in a great mood. We got some classic news. How about that?
Yeah, man, finally. It's been a long time coming, so I was pretty surprised to see it today, honestly.
Absolutely, me too. I literally it's early morning here in Australia, and I got woken up to a bunch of my Discord members dinging me madly, going, Josh, get up, you got to have a look. So, yeah, it was great to see. So, obviously, I'll just let people know that you were so gracious to come back on the show, and today we're going to be discussing everything and anything Warlocks, and it's going to be a bit of a general overview of the Warlock situation in Classic WoW, and then later on, maybe a couple of months down the track, we'll get more into specifics with specs and things like that. But today will be relatively blanket. But just before we get into that, as I said, we did get some Classic news, and I just wanted to get your quick take on it as someone who's obviously very, very invested in Classic. What did you make of what Blizzard told us?
So what we got today, I think, is generally great news. It's pretty much what I think most people, at least myself, people I know, expected. 1.12 talents, which is super important, considering anything prior to that is typically very unbalanced as far as classes go. Class balancing began, I want to say, in 1.6 and ran all the way through 1.12. And prior to 1.6, things were kind of a mess as far as class balancing and touch goes. Warriors, rogues, mages, priests were extremely, extremely strong. And they're still extremely strong in 1.2, but even more so than they are now. With druids, hybrids generally speaking, warlocks as well, being pretty down there as far as class strength goes. So I think that's one really great thing, is that they're starting with the 1.12 base. They also mentioned upgrading the architecture, which makes sense as well, upgrading the client, Battle.net integration, all that good stuff, which is great to bring kind of everything up to current standards as far as technology goes. So at this point, I think really if they follow the general private server flow of things, it'll be something to look forward to, proper raid progression, proper itemization progression. And as long as they don't add anything in, they already mentioned no Xmog. They mentioned, no achievements already. So as long as there's no store or tokens in the game, I think we're pretty much good to go.
Okay, so, one extra thing, just I don't want to bury the lead too much, and I'm happy to talk just a little bit more about that news. Are you with me a little bit, and it seems to be already an initial reception that some people are giving the news. Is it kind of fair to say that this was well expected? This isn't exactly blowing a lot of people's minds in terms of looking into the crystal ball. We were kind of expecting 1.12.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty much expected. I think most people who really think it out and have experience or have looked at the patches prior to that, especially as far as class balance goes, that's the biggest thing, would want 1.12 for the most part. Again, just because even now, class distribution on private servers is not great. I mean, you have warriors, rogues, mages, priests generally is the top four, all between, probably 13 or 14 and 20% of the total population, and then warlocks and all the hybrids and such fall below. Especially druids, being 3-4% of factions. Same thing with paladins, shamans, between 5 and 7%. So I think it's super important that they did 1.12, because it'd be even like class distribution, would be even worse if they did patch prior to that. But to answer your question, yes, I think it was generally expected.
And just to finish up on it, my initial interpretation of the news is they actually got relatively, I'll say they got lengthy in their response in a way. And they obviously gave us a fair bit of an explanation of the difficulty of the project. But would you be with me and I'm going to be releasing another show on this soon, obviously on the news that we got, but would you be with me in sort of describing what we did receive outside of the announcement that we're getting 1.12 as a little bit of non-news?
I guess you could say it to an extent. I mean, any news is news at this point, since we haven't heard since last BlizzCon. Yeah. But yeah, you said it got a little lengthy, and I was nodding my head as you said that. I definitely agree. I expected it to be a quick, short little blurb about kind of where they were at, and it was a good few paragraphs. I was pleasantly excited, pleasantly happy to see that, or pleasantly surprised, I should say, to see that. So that was great. I expected, a few sentences, maybe a quick paragraph, and that was about it, saying, hey, we're still working on it. Here it is. But I'm glad we got some kind of foundation to work off of now from Blizzard, which is great.
Definitely. All right. Well, look, we might as well get into things with everything Warlocks. I know I'd love to sit here and talk about the news that we got all day, but we'll be covering that through the show through the week. So it was good just to get a little bit of an initial burst of your take on that. Now, obviously, as people know, you were on the show a couple of months ago now, and we talked about we touched on, your experiences with classes, class balancing, your thoughts, and you mentioned during that show that you obviously have spent a lot of time playing Warlocks. You also mentioned that you'd spent times with Rogues as well, but it seemed to be that Warlocks was really where your heart is. Is that fair to say?
Generally speaking, yeah. I mean, I have the most experience with Warlock. It's probably my favorite class, with Rogue being a very, very close second.
Okay. Now, we obviously got your World of Warcraft resume last time on the show, but I've just got a couple of really quick Warlock-related questions just to give people a little bit more idea of you and your experience with Warlocks. So let me just ask, how many times have you gotten a Warlock to 60?
3 or 4.
Okay. Excellent. Now, within the time that you spent with Warlocks, I know it may be hard to quantify, but let's say rough ballpark figure. Could you recall percentage-wise how much time of those 4 times you've dinged a Warlock to 60 you've spent in each of the 3 specs?
Interesting question. As far as rating goes, I probably would be in my raid spec most of the time. So probably 70-ish% of the time I was probably DS Ruin to my Sacrifice Ruin, and the other 30% was probably a mix of SM Ruin for farming and Night Flag for PvP. Nightfall Conflagrate, sorry.
Okay. Now, as a lot of the listeners know, I have not spent time with Warlocks, so we're going to treat this as a little bit of an educational podcast in terms of you're obviously extremely well versed in the class, and I want you to be as specific and go as nuts as you can with all the lingo and all that jazz. We were talking a bit pre-pod, and you mentioned even something as as basic a term to many Warlocks when you say something like Night Flag, and I messaged you back and I said, "What the fuck is Night Flag?" And you explained it to me. So we'll go quite specific here, but obviously some of my questions are going to be relatively rudimentary. But it's meant to be a bit of a something for everyone here. There's something for the beginners. There's something for the veterans. So I'll just start off with this. We'll do with the layup questions, and then we'll get specific. So why Warlocks for you? What got you started with the class? Why did they appeal to you as a person and a player?
So way back in retail vanilla, I was 13, I think, when it came out. And I saw my buddy playing whatever, and he got me into it. We played Warcraft 3 together prior to, and he got me into WoW as well. And I remember, vaguely remember rolling a couple characters and thinking they were all right. And eventually I made a gnome Warlock because I always liked the pet classes. They always attracted me for some reason. So I rolled a Warlock because I liked how they had pets and they were demons. I thought it was cool. And I kind of fell in love with the class. That was my first and only level 60 in retail vanilla. And I played it pretty much since then, especially on private servers. Nowadays, I don't play it just because it has pets and stuff. I just enjoy the play style of it. They're kind of a tanky mage. They bring a lot of utility both to PvP and to raids. They're extremely strong in PvP throughout all tiers of the game, from the start of a server to the end. They're very strong. Really underestimated class as far as PvP goes. PvE, they generally start off pretty slow in MC and Blacking Layer, and they pick up a lot of momentum as far as DPS goes come AQ and AQ and Nax. And they have a relatively high skill cap as well, which I enjoy. Having to micromanage your pet in PvP and such just kind of gives you that extra layer and level to really master your class, and that really excites me as well.
Okay, now flowing on from that, let's say outside of yourself personally, what kind of player would you recommend try a Warlock for Classic?
Honestly, they're pretty good for whether you're newer to World of Warcraft or even a veteran. For newer players, they're one of the easiest classes to level, second only to Hunter. So your leveling experience is generally easier compared to other classes because you have your pet, you have minimal downtime, you have a lot of ways to get out of situations, sticky situations you may run into. So it's really noob friendly as far as that goes, and as well as for raiding too. For a Warlock to raid properly, you're not using too many of your buttons. Your rotation, quote unquote, is not super complex or anything. And then for the veterans, there's something as well. You can really min-max and as far as raiding goes with the Warlocks and really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of how to increase your DPS and do the most your class can. And again, the skill cap as far as PvP goes is relatively high as well. So I think there's great things for both sides of the spectrum as far as player experience goes with WoW. Okay.
Now, you mentioned just a short while ago about your rating spec. And I guess if we take it all the way back to the beginning, we'll be touching on Warlock rating soon. But if we just dial it back and we say we're going on our great journey from 1 to 60 as a young, new, fresh Warlock, I'm presuming that your rating spec may be different from your leveling spec. As a Warlock levels, what do you recommend people level as?
So for Warlocks, it's kind of strange your leveling spec because you're going to hop between Affliction and Demonology a little bit. I definitely recommend staying away from Destruction. So typically, you want to pop into the Affliction tree, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the first couple points you actually want to take is in Suppression, which reduces the chance for enemies to resist your Affliction spells, and that's because any resists is wasted time and mana, and reduced efficiency. So you actually want to reduce your enemy's chance to resist your spells prior to going improved corruption to reduce the casting time. It's actually more efficient to get suppression. So you usually do 3 points into that, 2 into corruption, then grab improved life tap. After those 7 points, you would want to move over to demonology. And it's kind of up to you here. You can go improved Hellstone, you can go demonic embrace, or some kind of mix of everything in the first tier. What you're really looking for is 3 points into improved Void Walker. Because usually around level 15 to 20, your Void Walker and yourself may start running into threat issues where you'll pull threat off your Void Walker maybe, with the mob has 40 or 50% HP left, which is really not what you want. So getting those points in there to increase his threat is really important. And after those 8 points into Demo, then you'd shoot back over to Affliction all the way down to Shadow Mastery. And then you can go back to Demonology and continue filling that out. So it's a little odd considering you don't go straight down one tree. You generally also don't take the 31 point in Affliction. You kind of just move right over to Demo once you have the full 30 points in Affliction.
So you mentioned that suppression, that's where you want to go first. And obviously it's a great point that you make that as fun as it is to buff certain spells in terms of damage and potential, at the end of the day, you want these spells hitting their target. So when you say take suppression, what do you think is the common mistake that people do when they first invest their talents? Where are they going with it they shouldn't be?
So you have two choices in the first tree of Affliction, either suppression or improved corruption. And improved corruption reduces the casting time of it, and then suppression, of course, reduces the chance for enemies to resist your affliction spells. So generally speaking, people are like, oh, well, that makes sense. You want to make the spell instant, so they put all their points into improved corruption. And true, you do want it to be instant, but at lower levels, at least, it's more efficient to actually have those first few points into suppression, so you're not wasting that precious mana and precious time. And then you'd move over to improved corruption after the first few points.
As we go through the leveling process and we talk about things like perhaps rotations, and you'd go through your 20s, 30s, 40s, etc., what are some of the common misconceptions about Warlocks should be doing with their rotations as opposed to, say, what you do with your rotation? I think we lightly touched on it last time, but just to go into a bit more detail.
Sure. Immolate, I should say, is usually not efficient to use. Generally speaking, you'd want to use Corruption, Curse of Agony, and your Wand your way to death. Especially if you're not using Immolate or like Siphon Life. Usually I'd avoid Siphon Life as well, unless it's PvP. Avoid Immolate unless it's PvP. Those spells generally are not efficient. You want to use your Corruption, your Curse of Agony, and Wand away. And right when the mob is about to die, here's a little niche thing too. You want to make sure you also have improved Drained Soul, which, if anyone's familiar with priests, is basically like a priest's spirit tap for a warlock. Only trick here is your pet cannot get the killing blow on the mob. So when the mob has a couple percent HP left, make sure you pull your pet off the mob so you make sure you get the killing blow, so you get the buffed mana regeneration. Of course, if you're running around at like 80% mana, 100% HP constantly, throw some Siphon Lives in there, throw some Immolates in there to actually use a bit of that mana. But once you find yourself dipping into like 50% or below, stick to your Corruption and your Curse of Agony with your Wand, and then again the Drained Soul at the end. A lot of people like to fully dot their mobs, so they'll Immolate, they'll Corruption, they'll Curse of Agony, and they'll Siphon Life. And it's really inefficient because that takes like a quarter of your mana bar at least on a Warlock. So definitely try to avoid that and make a lot of use of your Wand. It makes a big difference.
Now, again, as we're going through this leveling process, obviously at various levels you get access to a few friends along the way, and we talk about minions. What are some of the common misconceptions with minions? What would you suggest people ride or die with through the majority of their leveling experience, or is it purely circumstantial and you have to be chopping and changing on a regular basis?
For the most part, you're going to ride and die with your Void Walker the entire way through. You'll have your Imp from level, 2 or 3 to level 10. Once you get the Void Walker, he's your best friend from 10 to 60. He's great in PvP, believe it or not, too. A little trick with him is he has an AoE taunt ability called Suffering. You can actually break players' stealth with it. So let's say a rogue stealth, and if you time it properly, if he's close enough to get hit by that AoE taunt, you can actually break his stealth with that taunt. Same with druids or anything with a stealth mechanic. So that's a cool little tip for it. And then he has his sacrifice ability, which is a huge shield you put on yourself. So again, really strong against any class, especially against like warriors and such. They're not going to generate rage when they're hitting your shield. You have plenty of time to dot them up and start draining their life slowly away. So he's basically your go-to guy. As far as leveling goes, you would really never have your Fell Hunter or your Succubus out, to be completely honest, unless you queue up for some battlegrounds while you're leveling. But while you're out leveling in the world, Void Walker is always where it's at.
In your opinion, whilst all the minions might have application in certain circumstances, what do you think is the most useless minion to the point that you question why Blizzard put it in the game?
Probably Succubus. I guess it depends on the PvP you're going for. As far as playing in pre-maze or playing more organized PvP, the Fell Hunter is 100 times better than the Succubus would ever be. Between Spell Lock and Devour Magic, which is the spell which you can use offensively against enemies or defensively on yourself or your allies, is a really strong tool to remove CCs, to remove buffs on enemies, etc. Succubus is more for just the playstyle where you're going to constantly just seduce the target, soulfire them, and just nuke them basically while they're CC'd forever. It's not my favorite playstyle. I don't find it very fun. You'd never use it in PvE ever. You'd never really use it in PvP unless you like that style. So Succubus could use some, if Blizzard changed stuff into that reworking, that'd probably be the one they'd want to fix up a bit. Not that I advocate for changes at all, but that's the one I kind of see as useless, quote unquote, for the most part.
Fair enough. Interesting to hear. Okay, maybe there were ulterior motives for Blizzard putting the Succubus in the game, but okay, that's good to know. So we've basically we're still going through everything. Tell me your experience. Well, what are your earliest memories, if you can recall them at all, or even if they're more recently on a private server? How would you summarize the Warlock specific quests through the game? Your class quests. What's your fond memories of those?
I always liked them. They kind of send you all over the place. At least on private servers, generally speaking, I skip, Succubus and Fell Hunter until I hit level 60, and I go back and do them real quick because you don't beat them while you're leveling. So I find it kind of a waste of time in that end. But I remember back in the vanilla days, I remember on my Gnome Warlock at level 20 something, your Succubus quest as an alliance, it sends you into the middle of the Barrens, way deep in the Barrens, down by Camp Tarajo. There's an NPC you have to talk to there. And you have to actually turn in, I think it's a couple quests, one or two quests to him. So you have to go back and forth a couple times into the Barrens. I remember running into the Barrens and, you're running through the gates and there's the guards there, and then, the red pops up, you're in Horde territory and running past Horde trying to gank you, and while you're a low level yourself. I always remember that being really fun and interesting. It's one of my more fond memories of vanilla, because you didn't know what you were getting yourself into. I had no idea where the hell I was going. You're surrounded by, enemies. It was a good time for sure. And then the other one, Enchanted Gold Blood Robe quest. I don't know why that one always brings me back to for some reason. I guess probably because it requires a lot of materials. It sends you all over the place, and it rewards you with a really strong robe that lasts you pretty close to 60.
Okay. Now, once you basically make your way to 60, let's say we're a newly dinged 60, what is your suggested spec at this point once someone decides, well, I've made it, I've completed my journey, I think I'm ready to venture into raiding, I now have to take a look at my talent tree and assess what I want to do as a Warlock. What's my number one spec that I should be looking for?
I guess it really depends on what you're really first getting into. I guess if you're looking to get into raiding, the first thing you're going to do when you hit level 60 is farm your previous gear. And generally speaking, SM Ruin, I personally think is better just because you're going to have a little bit less threat issues than you would playing DS Ruin. And those 5-mans early on in a server where your tank isn't generating a whole lot of threat and your Shadow Bolt is still basically a 2.5 second cast taunt. So you can multi-dot adds as well with Affliction. Your dots are a bit stronger. So I think generally speaking for farming Prebis, your SM Ruin spec is a little bit better. And then once you're ready to take that step into raiding, or your guild's ready to start raiding, as long as you're not the Imp Warlock, you'd want to spec into DS Ruin or Demonic Sacrifice Ruin. So the general spec for that is 7 points into Affliction, 21 into Demonology, and 23 into Destruction. So you hit Improved Life, Tap, and Affliction. You hit Demonic Sacrifice and Demonology, and you hit Ruin plus a couple extra points in Destruction. If you are your guild's Imp Warlock, most guilds run one Warlock with the Imp out in the tanking group for the Blood Pact buff because it's really strong. It gives your tank a whole lot of extra HP. For that spec, you'd usually run 27 points into Affliction, 3 into Demonology for improved Imp, and then 21 again into Destruction for that Ruin talent.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned that SM Ruin is something that you generally favor. Is that something that's purely based on numbers, or is it also a little bit of your love of the feel for the gameplay with that spec?
I prefer it only for farming like 5 and 10 mans for gear. Once it gets into raiding, I would prefer DS Ruin because the numbers are slightly higher. Generally speaking, you can be competitive with a full SM Ruin if your guild is willing to give you a debuff slot for corruption, because you can get the Nightfall procs from it for the instant Shadow Bolt cast. So unless your guild's willing to give you a slot for that, generally speaking, your DS Ruin is going to out DPS your SM Ruin by, not a crazy amount, but generally speaking, you should be out DPSing your SM Ruin counterpart. Again, unless they get a full-time corruption debuff on bosses.
Okay, well, you mentioned that term Night Flag earlier. Is Night Flag something that, what is Night Flag really, and how does it come into play end game?
So Night Flag is my personal favorite PvP spec, just because it's the most fun in my opinion. It's Nightfall, and then in Affliction Tree, and all the way down to Conflagrate, so deep 31-point destruction. Purely PvP spec, you would never really use it in a PvE setting.
Not a way.
And as far as it comes into play, like I said, just for PvP, it's a whole lot of fun. You have insane burst potential, a lot of instant cast spells. You're like, kind of like a tankier mage almost, but you do have some less defensive cooldown than the mage would have.
Okay.
But almost as much burst potential as well.
Okay. Now, I'll just take you back a step. Just sort of thinking about the leveling process a little bit. Let's talk downtime a little bit, because it's something that I'm sure is easily shot down and debunked. But my thought always when I think of caster classes is I hate downtime. It's a big pet peeve for me that has kept me away from caster classes historically. What is your assessment of any potential downtime with Warlocks, either early game, mid game, or late game? Is it only existent in the first few levels, or is it something that also comes up in the later side of the game? But obviously you've got some abilities that might combat that. What's your assessment of the situation?
So yeah, early on you'll always have a little bit of downtime on a Warlock, but once you pick up that improved Strange Soul talent, your downtime can be nearly eliminated. I don't want to say completely, because you'll always have a little bit of downtime here and there. If you mess up a pull, or you pull too many, or you run into a sticky situation, there's always going to be downtime to some extent. But it's not like a mage where every 3 to 4 pulls you have to eat and drink back to full. Not even close. If you level properly on a Warlock with the proper rotations and everything, and you're careful about how many mobs you pull, you can kill 1 to 2 mobs at a time and end with, almost 100% HP and almost 100% mana pretty consistently for the most part.
Okay. Now, you said that word feeling a bit tanky a couple of times now. I've just got a comment I wanted to read you out that I found on Reddit and get your thoughts on this one. And this is from a user named Sigseg, and they say the following. Soul-linked Warlocks couldn't viably tank instances, even though some Warlocks were deluded into thinking that they could. For a brief period, the Fell Hunter had 2 bugged abilities which allowed it to tank instances. This was fixed in early 2005. Now that's the post, and my follow-up question is this. While I'm not suggesting that Warlocks can tank instances, what are your thoughts on very, very rare circumstances or encounters where is it a possibility, or is it just completely ridiculous?
Well, Warlocks actually do tank 1 boss fight in AQ40. You need a Warlock. You don't need one, but 99% of guilds out there use a Warlock tank on Twin Emps, because he deals a lot of shadow damage. And Warlocks have a really easy time mitigating that through gear with a lot of shadow resistance, and then shadow ward as well, which blocks, I think it's 920 shadow damage every 30 seconds. You also have a talent with your Fell Hunter, which gives you a massive amount of resistances to everything. So you can really easily build up your resistance to be nearly 300 shadow resistance, and you can tank that boss very easily. And Warlocks have extremely high threat when they want to, spamming Searing Pain. So you actually will almost always use a Warlock to tank one of the twins on the Twin Emperor encounter in AQ. Beyond that, I wouldn't really recommend tanking anything on a Warlock. I mean, if you and your healer are, well out gear, like a 5-man instance, you could probably do it as a Soul Link Warlock. it would be a bit much and unnecessary. But could you do it? Sure, you have the threat for it. You just don't have a taunt. AoE packs, well, you could actually hellfire the AoE packs. So yeah, you could probably get away with it. But it would definitely take a much higher gear level than that instance would require typically.
Okay. Just turning back to rating, I've got another couple of posts I want to read out to you, and again with a follow-up question. So this one's slightly long. It shouldn't take too long, but just hear me out on this one and then I'll get your thoughts. So this is a post again at Reddit from a user named Angry Rider who said the following. I rated on retail vanilla as a Warlock. I was often top DPS, nearly always among the top 5 at least, with a few exceptions. I was very proud of the fact that I was number 1 DPS for Sapphiron, which is the ultimate single-target DPS race in the game. And also, I've heard things that on private servers, it can tend to be a little bit different, but I'm of the opinion that that could easily be due to an imperfect simulation of what vanilla retail was really like. One thing I loved about being a Warlock is when you're doing a tough fight and half the raid is dead, you can really hang on and be self-sufficient with drain life or even siphon life on fights with adds without a healer in situations where any other DPS class would just die. Now, someone got back to them, and this is the one that I want to ask you about, because user Zrizzle says this. That honestly brings into question the factual skill level of the rogues and warriors in your guild, more than it proves that locks were okay. Top-end guilds didn't have meters that looked like yours. It more than likely meant that your guildmates were subpar than you being the one dude that could play a lock competitively. So here's my follow-up question. When we talk about locks and raiding or DPS in a group situation in general, and we're talking about the kind of damage output that you can have. And people obviously do say that locks are, relatively high DPS. Is that due to the other classes not pulling their weight? Or is it because locks, no, they're actually a freaking great DPS class?
It really depends on a lot of factors. What your gear is like, where you are itemization-wise, and on the server. So are you where are you playing? Are you in AQ? Are you in Nax? Are you in Blackwing Lair? Are you in MC? A lot depends on that. Early on in the server and the server's life, generally speaking, the Warlock should be nowhere near the top. Melee will completely dominate you through MC and Blackwing Lair. Now, once Warlocks start picking up gear from AQ 40, and they start having their bits from AQ 40 and Blackwing Lair, you can start really pulling some good numbers on the meters. In my guild that I played with on Lightbringer, I was pretty consistently top 5 DPS in Blackwing Lair and in AQ 40 when I had all my hit gear, when I was pretty much fully geared, and when I was completely consumable out, flask the whole 9. And that was I'm very, very try hard when it comes to that. So, I always give it 150% effort to pull the best numbers I can. Mm-hmm. So usually it'd be like me and a couple rogues and warriors and maybe a mage in AQ 40 because they have the ignite buff. But yeah, once you get that gear, once you get your AQ bis and your Blackwing Lair bis, you can pull some really high numbers on a Warlock and be, consistently top 5 overall damage and DPS in those raids. In MC, generally not, because you can cleave everything down on a melee and you'll usually not really come close. But Blackwing Lair, you definitely can. AQ, you can. Nax, you definitely can. And as far as the guy's first comment goes, he said he remembers from vanilla. No one knew much about vanilla back then. People played a lot different. People didn't itemize properly. People didn't have the proper specs back then. So you really can't compare that to private servers now. And Patchwork is definitely the bigger DPS fight over Sapphiron. So that was a little misinformation as well. That's what I can remember from him saying, at least so far. Yeah, definitely. Well, given what you've said just there, and given the amount of information that's available to us all now, would your assessment of the Warlock class be that it is still a relatively harder class to play well, or do you think less skilled players can still kick ass a little bit on the damage meters without being particularly good at the game if they are a Warlock? Generally speaking, people of any skill level can really play Warlock. It's not a super difficult class to play in PvE. The majority of your time is spent spamming Shadow Bolt and then Shadow Burn off cooldown. There are some little things you can do, like using Death Coil at the proper time when you're moving to get some damage in, or using Searing Pain if you have to move very quickly, or when the boss is about to die, use a couple Searing Pains to make sure you get that little bit of extra DPS on the boss. But a big thing for casters in vanilla is positioning. The less you have to move during a boss fight, the more you get to cast, the more DPS you're going to put out. So positioning ends up being a huge deal, more so than a lot of other factors for casters.
Now, flowing on from that, in a relatively similar vein of question, I'll ask you, I'll put one more post to you, and it says this. I've forgotten this user's name, so apology to them, but I hope there won't be hundreds of thousands of mages and warlocks in Classic, given that people have gotten used to convenience in retail WoW. Portals, summons, conjuring water and food, crowd control, pet tank for locks, dots, and running easy mode PvP if you're affliction with soulstones, etc., etc. That's the comment. So my question is two-pronged. A, from your experience in private servers, do you find that there are, the proverbial thousands and thousands of locks present in the game? And then the second part of the question is, do you think being a lock is easy mode and retail-like?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it easy mode for PvP. Definitely not on a Warlock, because the skill cap is pretty high, and if you're not a good Warlock player, you're going to get destroyed by most classes. But again, a good Warlock can put up a good fight against most other classes. Pets are great. They have some utility and some use. Summons are nice, but that's not enough to take away from rogues, from mages, from warriors, from priests and vanilla, which are generally speaking the more dominant classes as far as class representation goes. Warlocks are usually down there. They're usually, the bottom, 4 or so classes, generally speaking. Especially on Alliance, because you have to deal with Will of the Forsaken on Undead, and a lot of people don't want to deal with that. So you'll see even less Alliance Warlocks than you will Horde.
I'll take you one more time to another comment. So I found a few interesting ones, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this one from user KefTank again over at Reddit, who says this: I'd seriously question if immolate/conflag should be used over corruption come AQ/Nax. It really depends on what Blizzard will do with Arcanite Dragonling's debuff, since it adds a flat damage buff to anything fire. So my follow-up question is, A, is that the case? But it's more based on this. They mentioned that word debuffs, and even though it's a specific one they're talking about, what can you say about the way in which warlocks have to manage debuffs and what should be used in raids when you've got those limited slots?
I highly doubt you would ever see any guilds have warlocks specing to immolate conflag. I think it would, even with the Dragonling buff, it would be a huge DPS loss compared to other standard warlock specs. Because you're losing out on demonic sacrifice to go that deep into destruction, and it's definitely not worth it as far as numbers go. As far as warlock debuffs go, when you only have 8 debuff slots, the only warlock debuffs that warlocks are going to be using are their 3 curses. So typically, most high-end rating guilds only run 3 warlocks in the beginning because their DPS isn't the best, and they can apply all their debuffs. You can apply Curse of Weakness, Curse of Elements, and Curse of Shadows. Come 16 debuffs, if you're lucky, you might have one warlock who gets a corruption spot, and that would be your imp warlock, so he can use his instant corruption and get some nightfall procs, hopefully, during boss fights. But that would probably be the extent of debuffs. It's maybe a corruption if you're lucky, and then definitely all 3 curses.
Okay. Finishing up sort of on rating a little bit, just out of interest, what do you say are the best and worst encounters to face as a warlock?
There's nothing particularly awful, honestly, as far as encounters go for warlocks, since they're pretty straightforward as far as rating goes. Molten Core generally kind of sucks because your gear is always going to be poor in the beginning, so your DPS will be low. And after the first few clears, most good guilds will cleave everything down at that point, which does nothing for your DPS but make it worse. So generally speaking, I kind of hate MC because on a warlock, you'll never really be near the top as on most fights except for Rag. Rag, you can get closer to the top. But everything else, since you're cleaving most things down, you're generally closer to the bottom. Magmadar, Rag, you can do decent on. Gar, you can do decent on. That's about it. Blackwing Lair, everything's pretty straightforward as a Warlock. AQ, Nax, nothing particularly awful. But Molten Core I generally despise as a Warlock for that reason.
Okay. Now, you said something earlier that really did interest me when you said that PvP for Warlocks, and if you're, let's say you're a diehard PvP player, you said that locks generally are quite underestimated when it comes to PvP. Tell me why that's the case.
I'm not sure. Just generally speaking, I see people kind of write Warlocks off as far as PvP goes. Maybe because it's a higher skill cap class, so you don't run around seeing too many great Warlocks out there. But the great ones you do see can, do some awesome stuff, 1v2, 1v3, depending if they have the proper consumes up and cooldowns. So that's probably the general reason of it. You don't see a lot of Warlocks A, and B, it is a higher skill cap class, so you see even less good ones on top of that. That would generally probably be it.
Okay. Now, just to touch quickly on a couple of more, annoying aspects of playing a lock in a way. What are your thoughts on the soul shard system and how it works in vanilla? Were you fine with it? Did it piss you off? Was it a necessary evil? What do you say?
Honestly, it's not that bad. A lot of people like to complain about it, but it's really not bad. You can take 10 or 15 minutes with a couple buddies while you're waiting for your raid to start and farm some shards outside the raid or, in a zone. And then once the raid starts, you can farm shards off of every single trash mob in that raid, which is usually a lot. So even if you walk into the raid with only 5 or 6 shards, you can easily end up with a whole bunch, like a full bag of them, before the first boss even starts a lot of the time. So I don't think it's awful, no. Well, I never really had a huge issue with it.
Okay, I read a few posts just in preparation for this interview, and I think I'm with you. I disagreed with a few that I found because there was a lot of people venting online saying, everybody hated the shard system. It was bullshit. And I think everyone is a little bit of a stretch. I'm sure there were people that had issues, but would you say the Warlock community in general just sucked it up and was fine with it?
Yeah, generally speaking, I mean, that's, I guess you kind of said like the necessary evil, quote unquote. I wouldn't go that far either, since I personally don't think it's that big of a deal. But if you enjoy the playstyle of a Warlock, I mean, if that's the biggest detriment to you, I mean, you did pretty good, I think.
Is there anything, and not to put you too much on the spot, but is there anything personally that you have thought of over time that would be an improvement to the system?
Honestly, not really. No, I'm totally fine with how Blizzard did it. I don't think it's awful. I don't have to farm soul shards and have as much downtime as a mage has during leveling or something. So I really don't think it's that bad. I never really thought of any ways or reasons to change it. I was always pretty content with how it was. Okie
dokie. Now, just getting into a listener question now. We've got a listener question from Countdown to Classic listener BRG Boy, who asked the following of you, MarkyMark, and they say, I'm not much of a cloth wearer, but I plan on rolling as a lock my first time for Classic, and I'm looking for all the information I can get. So my question for DaReal MarkyMark is this. As a Warlock, what are some tips to counter rogues in a one-on-one situation?
So while you're leveling, you're always going to have your Void Walker out. So I mentioned briefly earlier that it's difficult, but if you time it properly or the rogue vanishes on top of you, if you're quick enough, you can hit his Suffering, the AoE taunt, and actually break his stealth, which is huge. Denying his opener or his second opener if he vanishes is massive into the gameplay. On top of that, Sacrifice is a huge shield to use against him as well. If you have Curse of Exhaustion at that point, you can try kiting him. So he blows his sprint. You can coil during the sprint a lot of the times to waste a few seconds off of it. If he's undead, it's always worse because he'll have a little Forsaken. If he's not undead, it's not too bad if you can juke the kick. Juking the kick during your fear is huge because you can dot him all up fully with all instant cast spells. But if he kicks your fear, you're kind of a sitting duck for like 6 seconds. So juking that is super important. Those would probably be the main things. Don't panic life tap. A lot of Warlocks panic life tap for some reason. They start to panic and they hit life tap. I don't know why. But I've noticed a lot of Warlocks do that for whatever reason, because it actually lowers your health pool, obviously. So dot him up, try cutting with Curse of Exhaustion, juke the kick, coil the sprint to waste a few seconds of it. Make sure to re-Curse of Exhaustion if he sprints, because a lot of the time rogues will have improved sprint during leveling. So it'll actually remove that debuff off of him. That's generally it. Use Sacrifice, obviously, and use the Suffering if you can to break a stealth.
Okie dokie. Now, a question of mine, one last one before we get to the fun stuff. We talk about itemization in WoW and obviously certain, items that people should look for, and then we lead into, pre-raid BIS, all that stuff. We know what to hunt for. Are there any items that are a little bit off the beaten path, or perhaps just not spoken about as often, that you would suggest leveling locks really should gun for on their journey to 60?
There's definitely a green tailoring set in the low level 40s. I believe it's called Shadow Weave. Don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure it's Shadow Weave. You can easily find it on a database if you just go through tailoring recipes. It requires like the low, like 42 to 44, I think, to use it all. And it's a bunch of like spirit and shadow damage. I believe it's a lot of spirit on it. Spirit is actually fine for Warlocks while leveling. Spirit's fine for actually most classes while leveling because improved regeneration never hurt anybody. Especially with your improved drain life or drain soul talent, it helps a lot as well with your regen. But it adds also a lot of plus shadow damage to your spells. So you definitely want to pick all that gear up if possible. If you're a tailor, you can make it yourself or buy it off the auction house as you're leveling. It'll make your leveling a lot more efficient through the 40s because you have all that extra spell damage and spell power. Beyond that, PvP trinkets are always nice to have. The nifty stopwatch from the quest in the Badlands. Skull of Impending Doom is also from a long chain from the Badlands, which allows you to break things like polymorph or allows you to break things like blind where otherwise you wouldn't be able to. Those are generally the main ones, I would say.
All right, MarkyMark, you've made it through the interview, and now it's time for anger management. Each episode, I ask the interviewee to get something off their chest that makes them angry about World of Warcraft. But, MarkyMark, I'm going to tweak this a little bit for you, considering you've done anger management for the show before. Now, we just got some news about Classic WoW for the first time in forever. So my question's going to be, do you have something about that particular post that irked you a little bit that you'd wish they had said?
I wish they went a little more detail as far as raid and itemization progression goes. Wishful thinking, just to hear from that kind of so early since it's only been in development for 6 or 7 months now. That would have been really nice to hear because that would have put pretty much all my worries to rest as long as they don't add in anything from retail. No shop, no tokens. We already know there's no transmog. We already know there's no achievements going to be in it. So those last couple things, mostly raid progression, like will we start like Pirate Surge where it's MC and Onyxia, in 6 months we'll have Blackwing Lair, and have like a Blizz-like timeline through there, as well as itemization progression. Like I would prefer to not have like 1.12 items in the game. If they did, it wouldn't be a deal breaker, but it'd be nice to have item progression throughout as well. So it would have been nice to hear, but hopefully we hear back from them again sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you for getting that off your chest. And with that done, now it's time for the hot seat. Each interview, I put the interviewee on the hot seat and ask a few fun hypothetical questions involving the game. So, MarkyMark, you ready for this?
Let's do it.
Okay, MarkyMark, question number 1. So, a warlock, a rogue, and a hunter walk into a bar. Who gets the girl and why? I want to say warlock, but probably hunter, because probably has a cool, cute pet that she would like, especially if it's a cat or something. Oh, of course.
So, probably the hunter.
Of course, the pets always get the girls coming up. Oh, man, that's a great answer. Fantastic. All right, next question. Fuck, marry, kill. I'm going to give you 3 builds, and you've mentioned that you have a little bit of a thing for all of them, so I'm going to put you on the spot. SM Ruin, DS Ruin, and Night Flag. Who you got?
Let's see. I'm trying to think of what I would use the most. I'd probably marry DS Ruin since it's your usual PvE build. I would fuck Night Flag since I would use it all the time in PvP whenever I respect. I also have it on the side, And then I would kill SM Ruin.
Ah, interesting. I thought you'd kill Night Flag. There you go. Okay, next question. If you could summon one person in real life to your location right now, if you had that Warlock power, who would it be and why, dare I ask?
Give me a second on this one, too. Probably Jeff Kaplan or one of the Blizzard devs so I could sit there one-on-one and chit-chat with them about Classic and, my opinion of it and how they've been going, with it so far with the information we have and what I think they can do or should do and shouldn't do. So probably that.
You, sir, are a gentleman and far more mature than I, because I would have said something like a porn star or something. That's an answer.
That's the first thing that came to
mind. Okay, moving right along. Can you remember your greatest PvP moment of triumph as a Warlock?
I don't know if I can think of one specific play or outplay or anything, but I'll always love a fresh vanilla server like we have coming next week, and Ungoro Crater is always a war zone between guilds and players fighting for territory and contesting tags and stuff, and I always just loved playing on Ungoro just for the PvP aspect alone. I remember on Elysium playing my Orc Warlock and there just having a blast with some guild mates and fighting for territory and tags versus other guilds. It was just a lot of fun. So I guess I can't say one specific fight or anything, but generally speaking, that's probably the most fun I have as far as PvP goes, is usually in Ungoro.
Okay. Now, as you say, I didn't actually ask. I presume you will be rolling on the fresh server coming out soon. Is that right?
Indeed, yes.
And will you be rolling as a Warlock?
Actually, I won't be. I was originally planning on playing a Warlock, but I just played one on Lightbringer for the past server. We cleared KT the second week of next Ramus release, and I played a lot of Warlocks. So I kind of want to save Warlock for Classic again. I don't want to kind of burn myself out on the class per se, because I want to play it 2 to 3 servers in a row if you count Classic as a server. So I'm switching it up. I have played some Warrior in the past, but it's not my most experienced class, and they seem like a lot of fun. They have a higher skill cap in both PvE and PvP, and it's a really important spot in the guild as well. So it's kind of something new I want to tackle and just kind of see how I enjoy Warrior and Endgame.
Okay, one last question before I let you go, and that's this. The language filters are off. You can say whatever you like. Is there one thing you've always wanted to yell or scream to people about what they tell you how Warlocks should be played that they don't understand?
I said this in the Warlock video when I made my class videos way back, like a year and a half ago now. I hate people who use the succubus. You can tell probably kind of when I talked about it earlier, I'm not a fan of the pet. There's zero skill involved with using a succubus in duels or in world PvP. It's just an unfun play style, and I hate Warlocks who use it, so fuck you guys.
Okay. Excellent. All right, mate. Thank you so much again for coming on the show. Please do plug your stuff again. Where can people find you online?
I stream these days at twitch.tv/DaReal MarkyMark. My YouTube, although it's not been super active lately, I was actually thinking about making a video on the Classic news today. We'll see if I follow through with it or not. My YouTube is also DaReal MarkyMark. And if you want to follow me on Twitter for updates and stuff, you can feel free. My Twitter is DaReal MarkyMark, so no A after D.
Fantastic. MarkyMark, I should say. Thank you so much for coming on the show again. I really do appreciate it. It's always a pleasure having you on, and we hope to talk to you again in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure coming on. I had a lot of fun the first time and now again as well. So thanks for having me again. I really appreciate it.
And that's the interview with DaReal MarkyMark done. And thank you so much to him again for taking the time out for Countdown to Classic. That's obviously his second appearance on the show, and he is open to even more appearances later down the track. And I cannot thank him enough. He is obviously so insightful and such a delight to talk to. Thank you once again, MarkyMark. But with that done now, it's time for some listener chat with Josh in Calling Countdown. Okay, we've got another caller on the line now, and who have we got, and where in the world are you calling from?
My name is Eron, and I'm calling from just outside of Boston in the United States.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for calling in, Aaron. And just to let everyone know, you emailed me through the week and you mentioned that obviously you'd love to call into the show and discuss a few things. And luckily we were able to tee that up this weekend. And you wanted to touch on something that people have been dying to talk about, but Countdown hasn't touched it yet. Let's talk about you being an altoholic.
Absolutely. Yeah. My name is Eron and I'm an altoholic.
So how did this start up? Tell people a bit about your experience with alts.
I think it originally really started with, started playing with my friends, just a few months after release, kind of bounced around a little bit, tried different things. We kind of went our separate ways and, tried different classes and, I mained a druid, a resto druid all throughout classic. And then I just wanted to, burn things and freeze things and, just try different things. So, I just started dabbling and quite a few alts.
Okay, so if we run through the numbers here, you said you started up maining a druid. What did you wind up level capping in the end through vanilla?
560s with like pretty good raid gear. I had a druid, a mage, a warlock, a shaman, and a priest.
Wow.
I had a hunter pretty high up there and a rogue up there too, both in the high 40s, maybe 50.
And this was all pre-BC?
It was.
Wow, that's impressive. So the first question that pops to mind for me, if you've got all these 60s sitting there and your hunter who's almost 60, how did you divide your time and attention? Was there clearly one that you played more on, or you really did spread your time evenly?
Actually, I worked it around my raid schedule because I was a pretty hardcore raider with my druid, not clearing max, but getting pretty far into that. So I would do my raid schedule with that. And then in my off times, I would, level the other guys with some friends, like with my mage, I had a priest friend who would heal and I would just AoE farm and just kind of in my off times in the mornings when I first wake up or.
So with all these characters sitting there, is there one that you probably had the most fun with that you might gravitate towards more for classic?
I'd have to say I've always been a caster. I really like the druid. I think I'll go back to doing a druid. But mage and warlock are the ones that always just because they're pure DPS. Those are the ones that always kind of new server or something. I always go to one of those three.
Now, with your condition in regards to alts, are you going to do it all again for Classic, or are you going to focus on one character this time?
I've been going through YouTube, all the YouTubers that I watch, everyone I subscribe to, and just saying like, how do you pick a main in Warcraft, even though I've been playing it for, 14 years, and just to be like, how am I going to do this? Am I going to stick with a main or am I going to do it again? So honestly, I don't know yet. I think I'm going to main a druid, but I do think that I will also at least have one other character, just to scratch that itch.
One thing you said of interest, which, I mean, sure, it's piqued my interest at times, but I don't think I'd ever go through with it. You leveled your priest as holy. Is that right?
Yes. Just because I was curious, is it really that hard?
And so in doing that, I appreciate coming to it from the angle of trying to, mix things up a bit and see if it was really as difficult as people said. What was your experience like? Was it that hard in the end, or do you think it's a little bit overblown?
It's more tedious, really. I always like leveling healers because you can never die. So it was more of a tedious thing than really more of a difficulty thing.
Of all the alts that you have taken to 60, let's say maybe the Holy Priest is number one, but if we exclude the Holy Priest, what was the most difficult or boring or annoying journey to 60 for you so far?
I'd have to say the Shaman, honestly. I think just because at the time back in Classic, I remember hearing how overpowered they were, and I think when I started playing it, that was just one class that I couldn't really figure out. Only once I got up there and started healing, that was fine, but that was probably the hardest one for me.
Now, have you spoken with other people who do the same thing that you do, who spend copious amounts of time with the game to the point that they can fairly and evenly spend a bunch of their time on numerous characters?
Yeah, I have. Not in a while, but even in my main raiding guild back in Classic, quite a few of us had several alts to like farm mats and things like that.
And is it a certain type of personality that you think would be required to dedicate yourself to really going through alts the way in which you do? Because I guess you could say everyone, of course, has created alts over time. We dabble with classes here and there just on that short, sharp journey to 10 or 20 just to muck around. But you're really going, all the way, so to speak. And so do you think it requires a certain personality for that?
I mean, at the risk of, generalizing, I think it would take a fairly, a person who could, stay calm, focused, kind of be very goal directed in that sense. Not to say that people aren't when they play WoW. Everyone has their goals of, PvP, whatever. But I think it would take a person who is more relaxed into it. Otherwise, if people get bored too easy, it's going to be really hard to stick to it, especially in Classic.
Okay, so when you're basically balancing your time between all these alts, what do you do with your choice of professions? Do you also mix it up and dabble in all the different professions, or do you find yourself picking the same ones over and over again?
Yeah, definitely. My approach to alts has always been being self-sufficient. One, because I'm always broke. I'm not good at the auction house or anything like that. Plus in Classic, there's a lot of cool quests that require things from various professions. And I remember I hated to kind of sit around doing that, waiting for those things or finding them. So I just want to do it myself. So I always like to do, rogues or druids with leatherworking, things like that. But I think having a lot of alts, it can be really helpful to be self-sufficient and send things to different characters and prop characters up, not just for money and bags and things like that, but everything else from enchants and quest things, quest items, all that.
Okay, and I guess one more question I should ask is that for someone who's spent so much time with all the classes, and I would gather that you have a lot of knowledge now about all the classes in the game and what they can and can't do, what are the top 3 classes that you're excited to roll on Classic? So you've mentioned that you'll probably go Druid as a main again. What do you think your top 2 alts are going to be?
Questioned. Definitely, yeah, Druid. I might do I think I'll have to do a Warlock again. I love Warlocks. Even though you just, Curse of Elements, that's it. Shadow Bolt. Everyone says that, but I always like to kind of push limits. I pushed limits with my Druid too. When I was when I would raid, I was pretty heavy into balance, and everyone says the number one worst class spec in vanilla is a balanced Druid. But I had the 24-27 spec, and I did pretty well healing with that. The other one would probably be either a mage or a priest, I think.
Okie dokie, fantastic. Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, it's not all doom and gloom for boomkins. As Taladrill said on the podcast recently, it can be somewhat down to the player. Like, they're not exactly a broken class. Maybe they're not as great as others, but they're still somewhat viable. So I'm glad that you had fun with the boomkin as well.
Hearing him talk about that, he had a great, nice, positive perspective on it, where even people who main druids will always have a negative perspective on, or often have a negative perspective on boomkins. He had a good take on it. I just like to have classes that can cover all those roles, tank, healer and DPS. I won't do warrior. I'm going to push a bear tank.
Fair enough. Now, knowing that you've gone through so many classes all the way to 60, and with as much as you enjoy creating and riding the train with all these alts, is there a certain class that you're still just not interested at all, despite being an altoholic?
I have to say the hunter. I just can't. Even though it was my first highest level alliance character I had. I've leveled several and deleted them. Even in like Wrath, I got 2, I think, into the 70s. I just deleted them. I just can't do it.
So you still took a hunter relatively high, as you said. Is it the case now that by this stage you have taken every class to 60?
Yeah, I mean, I still play retail, and I had at the highest point I had 4 servers full of almost all max characters.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Which is like 30. I think whatever that is, like, was it 48?
Now,
36, something like that.
Dare I ask, do you know...
It's too late to do math.
No, I appreciate that. But dare I ask, would you be able to guesstimate or ballpark figure what, up to whatever point your /play time would be?
Oh, you know what? I didn't think that didn't think we talked about that. I actually have a notebook somewhere with that done, but it was a couple of years ago. And I think I got up to about 500 some days, but I want to say this was quite a few years ago.
Wow. So
I don't know. That would be depressing if I did that now.
No, I understand. So that we could tack on a bit more time to that as of today. That's interesting. So obviously in saying that, and I think it probably goes without saying, but if we just speak about it out loud, with the amount of time and dedication, you've got this love of the game to the point that you've taken several characters all the way through. You've spent a lot of time with the game. You obviously, I know it sounds stupid saying this out loud, but World of Warcraft obviously has a very, very special place in your heart to the point that you have decided to devote a lot of time and attention to it. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And how has WoW affected your life in the positive, would you say?
It's definitely a great de-stressor for me. I mean, I do a lot of other things. I run, I do marathons, I meditate and read, write, socialize, things like that. But it's just when I just hit that a certain threshold, I'm so familiar with it. It's fun. It's comfortable. It hits all those points. So that's a huge help in terms of just de-stressing and kind of, not disconnecting necessarily with the world, because you're still social in the game and all that, but it's just a different kind than having like face-to-face interactions.
Now, just to move on to another topic that you mentioned in your email to me through the week, you said that you have autism spectrum disorder. Is that right?
Technically, it would be Asperger's syndrome, but that's not an actual diagnosis anymore. Unfortunately, it's all just under the autism spectrum.
Oh, okay. So with Asperger's, it's not the case that they took it off the DSM or anything? Is that just not the proper technical term or something anymore?
Yeah, Asperger's was taken off in the most recent, in the DSM-5.
Really?
Asperger's was removed, and it was kind of a issue in the community as well. A lot of people in the Asperger community were kind of upset by it, or really upset by it, and they kind of delineated the diagnoses along the 3 different levels of autism, as well as social pragmatic disorder.
That's really surprising. Obviously, I deal with the DSM every day through what I do for work, because obviously we have a lot of people applying for mental health applications, where obviously if they're trying to be diverted, they don't want to be dealt with at law for sentencing. If someone obviously can qualify as having a mental illness, then they get dealt with a little bit differently by the courts. I deal with people often who are trying to show to a court that they do have what is defined here in New South Wales as either a mental condition or a mental illness. This one would probably fall more under obviously a mental condition category. And I would have thought that Asperger's absolutely would be in there without fault. So that's really surprising to hear. But anyway, I digress. Having dealt with Asperger's, have you felt that, and obviously on the show we've touched on mental health recently as a relatively broad topic, just for about 15 or 20 minutes last week or so. How has Asperger's affected your interaction with the game?
I think the most difficult part would probably be the reading things through text, because you don't get people's faces and intonations and all those nonverbal cues and things like that. So sometimes you don't know sarcasm. I mean, I've been, working at it for a long time and all that. So you can obviously, you let things roll off your back. If you don't really get it, it's not that big of a deal, but that can be a difficult thing sometimes if you're in a guild and, you're having a conversation, potentially, or on the forums or something like that with your guild or just other people. And, sometimes what do you mean by that? So you just ask, what do you mean by that? So that's probably the biggest impact it's really had, is just reading things through text, because you can only ascribe your internal nation and, what you think the person means by what they're saying.
So just to give, again, and I apologize if I'm going to get this wrong, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I do, but my understanding of Asperger's is that there's some element of social anxiety behind it, and that interpreting or construing what some people might feel are, regular interactions with other people might be a bit more difficult to break down for someone with Asperger's. Is that pretty much, I know that's a very, very vague way of putting it, and there's a lot more to it, but is that sort of correct?
Yeah, you could say that. I think the anxiety is a result of not fully understanding social interactions. And everyone's different. I mean, there's a saying, you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, which, you could say for a lot of things. But yeah, I think, the anxiety can definitely be there. You learn to dealing with it. You stay quiet or you don't do it, or you just be direct and sometimes ask, like, what do you mean by that? That's kind of one way that I deal with it. I'm just like, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean.
Because the reason I'm asking is, my follow-up question to that is, with World of Warcraft being such a social game, particularly vanilla, as you well know, do you feel that really diving into the world of vanilla actually helped you, I don't want to say come out of your shell, but helped you deal with talking to people and learning how to, just speak to people? Not that you couldn't speak to people, but, dealing with Asperger's in a way. Did it help?
Yeah, it did. I fortunately was have enough desire and willingness to be social, and I had friends. I had really, really good friends, like in my dorm when I was in college, when I started playing WoW and things like that. And I've always had my social groups that think of the activities that I would do. I used to be a skater when I was a kid, so I had that group of friends, and my video game friends back in the day playing Final Fantasy VII for hours on end. So always had able to practice in those through those avenues. But as college went on and people were way more savvier and things were much more subtle, I had to find as many ways as I could to figure things out and practice and all that. So I don't think I really knew it at the time, because I didn't realize I had autism essentially until later, after college actually. So looking back, Warcraft was a really good place to practice those kind of things, like not to get upset if you don't understand something and people like kick you out of the group or for something or some issue happens. Yeah.
You also told me that you've got degrees in psychology and philosophy, and you ended up getting your master's in school counseling, and you work as a school counselor now. Flowing on from that, I've got some questions more about, I've always sort of been mildly interested in those fields in a sort of, a light fashion, as a lot of people are. Coming from your psych degree, do you find some interesting concepts coming up through your social interactions in World of Warcraft that you can sort of better understand through what you've studied?
Yes. That's a real, like, it's funny. That can be a very broad question.
Oh, it's incredibly vague, and I apologize.
Okay, because it's like I could go in so many directions, and I just don't want to like ramble on for too long or anything like that. One fun thing I've often thought about, I kind of did this years ago. This was back in like Classic and TBC. I would do studies on personality traits compared to classes that people mained, just as a fun little experiment. I've long since lost those notes. But I remember doing that, like, what kind of, what personality traits based on like the Myers-Briggs, which is a personality inventory, like match up most with, certain classes like a mage or a warrior, things. It was just a fun little experiment I was doing. So that's like a fun one, and more of a serious thing. Perspective. It's more just like how people interact with each other. How do you treat each other when you're in a group? Being in doing a 5-man, you have a leader. Is someone going to take the leading role, and then how do you respond to those kind of things? So just that kind of like a social psychological aspect.
Well, I'm so glad you hit on that, because that's where I was hoping to go with when I mean, what kind of stuff have you dug up when you come at it from a theory-based background in psychology? And you said you obviously did that study and found where people were placing on the Myers-Briggs scale. And I appreciate that it was years ago and you've lost your notes, but do you remember it all? Was it simply something that and I think the listeners would want me to follow up on this and not bury the lead, but is it the case that, rogues were narcissistic and, paladins were more prone to perhaps being, the Care Bear helping type? Like, what did you dig up in your studies or your findings?
Off the top of my head, it's I probably should have studied if I was going to think about this, and wrote some more stuff down. What I found was the ones I can come up in my head the most was that a lot of, and some of this I truly would have to give the caveat that this was through my own experiences and my own research, and only available. I wasn't able to do like a straw poll or anything like that, unfortunately. This is just through, forums and even my guild and my server and all that. What I found the most was that a lot of warriors had a lot of leadership qualities, things like that. There are a lot of military guys. Mages were very high on like perceptual and intellectual type thing perspective. I'm sound like an idiot, even though I have all these degrees and all that. I'm not very articulate right now.
No, you're killing it. I'm on the edge of my seat. So the only unfortunate thing that you said just then is now all the mages are cheering, going, "Yes, we're so smart. We always knew it."
Maybe a little pretentious too. Sure.
Yeah, take that, mages.
These aren't all things on the Myers-Briggs, by the way. I'm kind of just very like terribly generalizing here. But
is jerks on the Myers-Briggs scale? Because that'll be rogues coming up. You're all jerks, including me.
Yeah. D-bag totally is on there. That is one of the top. Trying to think what else. I played Horde side, so I couldn't say anything about paladins. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, were very calm. I noticed very, I think with the classes, they were very empathetic.
Is this for paladins, you mean?
Paladins, I mean, I don't know. I don't know any. I actually had one real life friend that was a paladin healer in his raid, and he was a really very kind, nice, empathetic person. So I think that off of that one person, maybe they're similar, I guess.
No, I appreciate it. But you mentioned calm before, and perhaps the calm personality types. What class were you referring to there?
Priest.
Oh, priest. Excellent. Fantastic. Well, that's really interesting. It's something that, honestly, if I ever tripped upon that kind of study, I would devour it, because even if you go on a more macro level and just talk about the kind of personality types that are drawn to Horde or Alliance is something I'd be fascinated by. Now, we can all sit here and guess just through our time spent in game and the kind of people that we talk to. You could probably, surmise on your own, well, I think I know that, the kind of people that roll Alliance are more, whether you say, what would be the best adjectives to describe them? Obviously people, let's say, start with Horde, maybe people living on the edge a little bit more who like to be maybe not so much anti-establishment, but like to ride the knife edge a little bit in terms of morality, perhaps. I don't know. What do you think would come up in a study like that?
I always compared the Horde like the Isle of Misfits.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of what I thought of people who, and even in game and in books, in the novels and comics and just in the Horde lore from Blizzard, they've always kind of called themselves like a group of just general a common alliance, and even though they don't mesh as well as the alliance in a certain sense.
It's something that I feel that even though the figures really do go towards, the middle, and it's pretty much a 50-50 balance of Alliance and Horde players, I find myself bumping into so many more Horde players. And this has been the case for years. And whether it's just that the personality that drives a Horde player is one that is far more vocal than that of an Alliance player, or there's an amount of pride that comes with self-identifying as a member of the Horde, as opposed to people who roll Alliance not really feeling the need to yell and scream what faction they play for. It's just something that's always fascinated me about the real mentality behind what drives people in their choices in the game when we talk about factions and classes.
In one of your, I don't know when it was, one of your recent podcasts, you talked about Alliance on there, and I laughed and started thinking about that, and I was like, I'm definitely would say for the Horde. I feel like in the forums I see a lot more Alliance. Maybe Horde just wants to be louder.
Maybe. Well, look, I can't thank you enough for calling in, and if you ever want to please yell out about anything in the future, please be my guest. But thank you so much for calling in today. I really appreciate it, and we hope to speak to you again soon.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And that's been Calling Countdown, and I'm sure that brought back a few memories for some of you with all that chat about alts in the game. And so with that, how about we take a trip down memory lane? Each week, Countdown to Classic reads through some listener submissions about some of their fondest memories from back in the vanilla days of World of Warcraft. So I've got a few here for you, and we start with this one from Countdown to Classic patron Hurlbert, who says this. Here's one for you, Josh. It was summer of 2006 and I'd just hit level 60 on my Tauren Warrior. I had been pretty frugal in my leveling journey, skipping on upgrades to spells like Rend, Mocking Blow, etc. My friends warned me how expensive your epic mount cost was, so by the time I hit 60, I had over 700 gold. I then asked my in-real-life friends to loan me the rest, and they were nice enough to lend me the 300 plus gold that I needed. A day or two after, I joined a guild that was interested in gearing me out for their raids. Thus, I had little time to farm and pay my friends back. I then used the little gold I could muster to sustain my raiding costs. After weeks of saying, I'll pay you guys next week, they took matters into their own hands. One day I logged in and noticed my character was a ghost and naked in Black Rock Mountain. My first thought was, that must be a glitch. To my surprise, it wasn't a glitch. I was in fact very dead, and my corpse was at the bottom of the molten span inside Black Rock Mountain. I was horrified. While I was walking back to my corpse, I was wondering how or why I got hacked. Once I spawned, which cost me 3 lives in order to get out of the lava, I also found my bags empty, not even a damn hearthstone, and I was also stripped of any gold. After I recovered from the initial shock and awe, I had half a brain to put a ticket up to Blizzard. I had no choice but to ask a guilty mage to port my sorry ass to Orgrimmar. I had no gold for flight paths and was not about to traverse the Eastern Kingdoms naked on a high-population PvP server. Anyways, to wrap this up, the GMs restored my gear and the pathetic amount of gold I had before the ordeal. When I told my friends on Ventrilo what happened, they couldn't hold back their laughter and confessed to the crime. I resented them for a few days, but then I got over it. In conclusion, this taught me a very important lesson about not paying your debts. To this day, I don't know how my friends found out my password, but we always have a good laugh about it. Next, we have this one from another Countdown to Classic patron and Countdown Council member, Camp Sowen, who says this. Back when I started my first character ever, a dwarf warrior named Sheepslayer, oh man, what an experience it was. Roaming around in Dunmoreau, first time entering Ironforge, and after a while arriving at Westfall. And there I came upon my first dungeon, and at that time I was a super noob. About 14 years old and having no idea what I was doing, I agreed to join a random group for the Dead Mines, and inside this dungeon for the first time ever, I encountered group loot, and not knowing what it was, I needed on everything. Shadow gems, cloth gear, and male gear alike. And for some reason the group kept calling me a ninja. And I just laughed and said, no guys, I'm a warrior. Can't you see? You damn noobs. Well, the whole story ends with me getting kicked from my first dungeon ever. Today, it's all just a funny memory of the good old vanilla times. Next we have this one, again from Countdown Council member 7 Winters, who says the following. Did you ever have any friends who would lie about World of Warcraft? I remember a friend of mine told us at lunch one day at school that he had an improved Fellhound on his Warlock that shot arcane missiles. Another friend told us again at lunch that he played a Night Elf Warlock to sound cool. Those were just words he had heard us say. He didn't actually play at the time at all. Another friend told us that he had a Griffin flying mount, and this was in vanilla before flying mounts existed. I asked him where he got it, and he said, somewhere in Kalimdor. So basically my friends just sat at a table at lunch every day and lied to each other. The next one we have from Melderon over at Def Camp and Melderon TV on YouTube, and they say the following. Hey Josh, I've got another memory lane for you. Def Camp was dueling a friend in Alterac Mountains near Dalaran and the Lordamere internment camp. Def Camp was on his priest and he was dueling our friend's mage. I had the pleasure sitting down and watching on my warrior. Towards the end of the duel, Def Camp feared the mage while his dots melted the mage's face. The mage went down to 1% health just as he was feared into the aggro radius of a bear. Needless to say, the bear had no problem one-hitting the mage before Def Camp could get out a heal. We laughed for a very long time, and our mage friend was a tad angry at us. Next we have this one from, again, Countdown to Classic patron Purgatos81, who says this. Best memory. It would be when my friends and I created a 5-man guild called 5-Man Army and started leveling almost purely through dungeons. We had to prepare a bit with finding quests and such, and that could take a couple of hours. Then we had to walk to the dungeon, which could also take a while. Finally, the dungeon itself could be pretty hard, and in the beginning we wiped a lot. After a while we got better, and our equipment greatly improved as well. After spending so much time in dungeons together, we actually became quite good at it. One evening, we played through Shadowfang Keep, and after we finished, 4 of us were waiting for our mage, who had gotten a pretty sweet robe. Suddenly, we spotted a lone human priest trekking through Silverpine Forest. He was 15 levels higher than us, and pretty confident he could walk past us. My team spurred to action, and after a long fight, the priest went down. Good times. And that's been Memory Lane, and I've just got a few quick cleanups and shout-outs before you all go. So, as it's all of you, the listeners, who are the experts on World of Warcraft, some of you do get back to me when I make a boo-boo, which I invite you to do on the show, and it's great that people have politely been taking me up on that. Turns out, something happened during, I believe it was episode 39, when I was talking about Fury Warriors. And I mentioned a couple of abilities in a forum post that absolutely were post-vanilla, so it sounded a little bit funny. And a number of you got back to me and very, very politely pointed that mistake out. And I got the following from Arya Stark, who said, I just got caught up today while on the ride on the mower. I can't remember exactly what it was, but during the Fury Warrior talk, there was one post that sounded a lot like it was post-vanilla warrior moves. And 7 Winters chimed in, what do you mean? I loved using Heroic Leap in vanilla. I used to Titan Grip Sulfurus and Ashbringer too. Now, obviously, I understand now that the mistake was made, and I do apologize. Thanks also to Melderon, Jay, and a couple of other people for pointing out the mistake. Absolutely, it will happen from time to time, and thank you, everyone. Now I can clean that up. Obviously, Heroic Leap was not in vanilla, and I do apologize for bringing that up. So, the next one I've got is a listener email from Victor, who emailed me a little while ago, and I just wanted to share what they had to say. And Victor says this: "Thank you for sharing your story about mental illness. I myself suffer from borderline and generalized anxiety disorder and definitely feel like we need to lift our stuff so that the stigma diminishes. So many people are afraid of sharing. A lot of people I can tell that they have similar problems, and I tend to open up to them and then make them feel accepted and heard, something that they might often miss. I also played World of Warcraft to escape reality. It got very bad at some points in my life, but on the other hand, it saved me from spending too much time with the wrong people who today are either hooligans or in prison mixed up with drug abuse. So it was very easy to argue with my parents when they asked me to spend less time at the computer. They knew my alternative wasn't really bright either. And Josh, I shared your pods to everyone. In Sweden, we're very frequently listening to Spotify, as you mentioned on air once. And I just want to say thank you so much to Victor for taking the time out to write me that lovely email. I do appreciate you opening up like that, and it's definitely something that I do want to touch on later on in the show again. It won't be the last time that we touch on this topic. Obviously, we touched on it today again, and it's something that I feel warrants a bit of further discussion when we talk about things like game addiction, as well as something that I would really like to touch on in the show. And if anyone has any particular stories on that front that they'd be brave enough to share, then I'd really like to do an episode covering off on some of the danger signs to look out for with addiction to games and World of Warcraft, and also how we can, as a community, try to basically combat that issue. But anyway, I'll take you to one last cleanup note, and this is a comment over at Reddit that someone put on episode 39, and this was from user Abs of Titanite, who said the following: "I'll comment on the Fury Warrior bit because that's what I have experience with on private servers, so take that with a grain of salt. A lot of the raiding pre-best in slot gear you listed is unavailable during the earlier patches, and the trinkets and rings you mentioned are unique, I believe, so you can't just get 2 Don Julios and 2 HOJs and call it a day. I also wouldn't include Arathi Basin / Warsong Gulch Exalted gear as pre-best in slot, at least without listing more obtainable alternatives. The time investment for those grinds is pretty immense. One thing I wish you'd mentioned was how important weapon skills are to warriors versus raid bosses. 40% of your autos will be glancing blows, and which are only 65% as much damage as a regular auto. With +5 to a weapon skill, you'll do 85% regular auto damage on a glancing blow, which is a huge boost to your damage and your rage. If players are looking to min-max their tunes for Fury DPS, they may want to consider using the races that get boosts to weapon skills. This was the first podcast of yours I listened to, and I loved it. I'll be sure to check out your others." And I say thank you very much, Abs of Titanite. I love it when I get corrections and insightful additions over at Reddit or wherever people might comment on the show. I do thank you so much. Thank you for finding the show, and I hope you are still very much so enjoying it. But as Abs of Titanite tells us, yes, it's a funny thing. When I was reading out that list and I went through the rings, I was thinking while I was saying it, I wonder if these are unique, and I should have known better and done a little bit more research. So I'm so happy to be called out on that. That was a little bit of incorrect information that I let out there, and I certainly don't want to be seen to be doing that. I'm trying to get it as right as I can here. So thank you again. Now, that's pretty much all for the cleanup, everyone. How about some shout-outs? Let's get geographic up in here and throw some love to Finland, Hungary, and Russia. I see the downloads coming, everyone, and I thank you and tip my cap to you. Stateside, how about a huge shout-out to Portland, Hartford, and Anchorage? If you told me that an Australian would be heating up in Alaska one day, I would have called you a liar, but here we we are. Thank you, Anchorage. I also want to thank the members of the Countdown Council, whom I call every week for input on where the show should head in the week to come. So, shout out to Borzen, Raidmark, Cam Sowen, Palfurus, Rarebit, Seven Winters, Tsunami, Wilson Ma, and Valaco. Thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support and constant feedback. I really do appreciate it. And also a big thank you to supporters Hurlbert, Good Kisser, Myrtle Banks, and Purgatos81 as always. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I shall see you again on Friday for Countdown to Classics forum-focused breakdown of the Dev Water Cooler Classic update. I'm really looking forward to that one, and I hope you all are too. I'm still working on it, so hope it all comes together as I have it planned in my head. Now, I will speak to you all then, so get out of here, you scamps. I'll see you later.